Hello, I am Sarah Mitchell, and at 32 years old, I never imagined that my own brother would be capable of humiliating me in the most devastating way possible on what should have been the most joyous day of our parents' lives. The morning sun cast its golden embrace over the pristine waters of Miami's elite bayfront marina, where million-dollar yachts rested like slumbering giants against the azure backdrop of Biscayne Bay. The air carried that distinctive blend of salt and luxury, the scent of polished teak, expensive cologne, and the promise of adventure that only the wealthy could afford. Crystal-clear waters lapped gently against hulls that gleamed like jewels, each vessel a testament to its owner's success and status. I stood on the weathered wooden planks of Pier 7, my heart beating with an unusual rhythm of anticipation and nervous energy. The simple white linen dress I had chosen for the occasion moved softly in the morning breeze, and my understated leather sandals clicked quietly against the dock as I shifted my weight from one foot to the other. In my right pocket, my fingers traced the cool metal edges of a set of keys that held more significance than anyone around me could possibly imagine. Today marked the 40th wedding anniversary of my parents, Margaret and Robert Mitchell, a milestone that deserved nothing less than perfection. For months, they had spoken excitedly about their dream celebration. "We want to celebrate on your yacht, sweetheart, sailing into the sunset with all our loved ones." Their eyes had sparkled with childlike wonder as they described their vision, and I had promised them that their dream would become reality. The irony was not lost on me that my brother David, who had built his fortune across the Atlantic Ocean, had no knowledge of the vessel that would serve as the stage for this momentous occasion. To him, I remained frozen in time, the spoiled little sister he had left behind 15 years ago when he departed for London to pursue his real estate empire. In his mind, I was still that naive 20-something who asked for money to cover rent, who changed career paths like seasons, who lived in their parents' shadow without any real ambition or direction. The morning had begun with typical Miami perfection. The sun rose like a golden orb, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, while gentle waves created a symphony of tranquility that only the ocean could compose. Seagulls called overhead, their cries mixing with the soft hum of boat engines, and the distant laughter of families preparing for their own maritime adventures. I had arrived at the marina 2 hours early, needing time to ensure every detail was perfect. The crew had been preparing since dawn, polishing surfaces until they gleamed, arranging fresh flowers in crystal vases, preparing the finest champagne and delicacies that money could buy. Captain Thompson, a weathered man with kind eyes and 30 years of experience navigating these waters, had assured me that everything was ready for what he called the celebration of a lifetime. As I watched the sun climb higher, casting dancing diamonds across the water's surface, my mind wandered to the journey that had brought me to this moment. 5 years ago, when David made his final move to London, announcing that he was done with American mediocrity, I had felt something shift within me. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was determination, or perhaps it was simply the realization that I could no longer live in the shadow of his success. The transformation had not been immediate or easy. I remember those first months after his departure, when the silence of his absence seemed to echo through every family gathering. Our parents would speak proudly of his accomplishments, the luxury apartments he was developing in Kensington, the high-profile clients he was acquiring, the lifestyle he had built among London's elite. Meanwhile, I was struggling to find my footing in a digital marketing startup that existed in a cramped office above a coffee shop in downtown Miami. But determination, I discovered, was a powerful force. While David was building his reputation across the ocean, I was quietly constructing my own empire. 18-hour workdays became my norm. I studied market trends until my eyes burned, learned every aspect of digital marketing until I could predict consumer behavior with startling accuracy, and slowly began to build relationships with clients who valued innovation over tradition. The breakthrough came during my second year, when a small campaign I developed for a local restaurant chain exceeded all expectations, generating triple the expected revenue and earning me recognition throughout the industry. Word spread quickly in Miami's business circles, and soon I was fielding calls from companies across the state, then across the Southeast, and eventually from major corporations seeking the kind of innovative thinking that traditional marketing firms couldn't provide. David's monthly phone calls during this period had become increasingly predictable. "How's the little entrepreneur doing?" he would ask with that familiar tone of affectionate condescension. "Still playing with computers and social media?" He never inquired about specifics, never asked about my clients or my growing team. In his mind, I was still the little sister who needed guidance, who would eventually abandon her phase and settle into something more conventional. I never corrected his assumptions. Perhaps it was pride, or perhaps I was waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. Each time he spoke of his latest acquisition or his expanding network of influential contacts, I would simply listen, offering appropriate congratulations while keeping my own achievements private. There was something powerful about this silence, something that felt like gathering storm clouds before a transformative rain. The purchase of the yacht had been the culmination of 3 years of unprecedented success. After expanding my company to offices in Atlanta and New York, after securing contracts with Fortune 500 companies, after seeing my name featured in business magazines as one of the rising stars of digital marketing, I had finally allowed myself one significant indulgence. The Serenity was not merely a boat, it was a masterpiece of maritime engineering. 58 feet of pristine craftsmanship with 5 luxurious staterooms, a main salon that could accommodate 20 guests in comfort, and a flybridge that offered panoramic views of whatever horizon beckoned. Every detail had been carefully selected, from the Italian marble countertops to the custom sound system that could fill the vessel with music or maintain perfect silence for intimate conversations. But more than its physical attributes, the Serenity represented something deeper. Proof that the little sister David had left behind had grown into a woman capable of creating her own destiny. Every time I stood on its deck, watching the sun set over the Miami skyline, I felt the satisfaction of knowing that this success belonged entirely to me. Now, as I waited for my family to arrive, I could feel the familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with something else, a desire for recognition that I had been suppressing for years. Today, David would see not just the yacht, but the woman I had become. Today, the assumptions and condescension would finally be challenged by undeniable reality. The sound of expensive leather shoes against wooden planks announced arrivals. I turned to see my cousin Jennifer approaching with her husband Mark, both dressed in the casual elegance that marked Miami's wealthy elite. Behind them, my Aunt Patricia walked arm in arm with her new boyfriend, a distinguished man whose silver hair caught the morning light. "Sarah, darling," Jennifer called out, her voice carrying that particular enthusiasm reserved for family celebrations. "This is absolutely gorgeous. When did you arrange all this?" Before I could respond, I heard the distinctive sound of a luxury car door closing in the marina's parking area. My heart quickened as I recognized the purposeful stride of expensive Italian shoes, a sound I had not heard in person for over 2 years. David had arrived. From the distance, I could see him approaching with that characteristic confidence that had always preceded him like an announcement. Even from 50 yards away, his presence commanded attention. The perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the Swiss timepiece that caught the sunlight, the subtle but unmistakable aura of a man accustomed to being the most successful person in any room. Behind him, our parents walked with the radiant joy of a couple celebrating 4 decades of shared dreams. Mother had chosen her favorite blue dress, the one that brought out her eyes and made her look 20 years younger. Father wore the navy blazer I had given him for his birthday, looking distinguished and proud as he escorted his bride of 40 years toward what they believed would be the celebration of their dreams. But it was David's expression that captured my attention. Even from this distance, I could see the way his eyes were scanning the marina, taking inventory of the vessels, the people, the obvious displays of wealth that surrounded us. His gaze moved with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating success in terms of visible assets and social positioning. He had not yet seen the Serenity. As they drew closer, I could hear fragments of conversation carried on the morning breeze. David was explaining something about maritime regulations in the Mediterranean, comparing American boating culture to European sophistication. His voice carried that familiar tone of authority, the sound of someone who expected his opinions to be received as expertise. "The boats here are impressive," he was saying to Father, "but nothing compared to what you see in Monaco or the French Riviera. Americans tend to prioritize size over elegance." I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. In less than 5 minutes, that confident assessment would be put to the test. The family group was now close enough for me to see individual expressions. Mother was practically glowing with excitement, her hands clasped together as she took in the magnificent vessels surrounding us. Father walked with the proud bearing of a man whose children had exceeded his greatest expectations. though he had no idea how dramatically those expectations were about to be surpassed. David's eyes finally met mine across the distance, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. He raised his hand in a familiar gesture of greeting, the same casual wave he had given me countless times during our childhood. But there was something different in his posture now, something that suggested he was already forming judgments about the scene before him. As they approached the final stretch of pier, I could see David's expression beginning to change. His confident stride slowed slightly as his gaze moved from boat to boat, clearly trying to determine which vessel would be hosting this celebration. I watched as his eyes passed over several impressive yachts before settling on the Serenity, moored majestically at the end of our pier. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or confusion. The Serenity was undeniably magnificent, clearly the crown jewel of this section of the marina. But I could also see him calculating, assessing, trying to determine how his little sister could possibly have arranged such an extravagant setting. The next few minutes would reveal whether David's assumptions about his sister's limitations were about to collide with a reality that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the woman I had become. But that revelation would have to wait, because as my family drew closer, I could see David's expression shifting into something that made my heart sink with a familiar dread. The look of someone preparing to take control of a situation he assumed required his intervention. What happened next would change everything between us forever. But in that golden morning moment, with the sun climbing higher and the promise of celebration hanging in the salt-scented air, I had no idea that the next few minutes would test not only my brother's assumptions about success and family, but also my own capacity for grace under the most unexpected pressure. The stage was set, the players were approaching, and the performance of a lifetime was about to begin. Will David's preconceptions about his sister's capabilities survive the shocking revelation that awaits him? And how will Sarah handle the moment when her carefully guarded secret finally comes to light in front of the entire family? The transformation of Sarah Mitchell from overlooked little sister to self-made entrepreneur had been neither sudden nor accidental. It had been forged in the crucible of necessity, pride, and an unshakable determination to prove that success could be achieved without the validation or assistance of those who had written her off as inconsequential. The journey had begun 5 years earlier, on a rain-soaked evening in October, when David had called from his newly acquired penthouse in London's prestigious Belgravia district. The conversation had started pleasantly enough, with the usual exchanges about weather and family, but it had quickly devolved into what Sarah would later recognize as the moment that changed everything. "Sarah, I need to be honest with you," David had said, his voice carrying that particular tone of elder brother concern that she had grown to dread. "I've been thinking about your future, and I'm worried. You're 27 years old, and you're still floating from one job to another without any real direction. Marketing assistant, social media coordinator, freelance whatever, none of these are careers. They're just ways to postpone growing up." She had been sitting in her modest apartment in Coral Gables, surrounded by the remnants of a dinner she had prepared for one, watching the rain streak down her windows while listening to her brother's assessment of her life's inadequacies. The sting of his words had been particularly sharp because they contained enough truth to make her defensive. "I'm building experience," she had replied, though even as she spoke, the words felt hollow. "The digital marketing industry is evolving rapidly, and I'm learning—" "Learning what?" David had interrupted. "How to post on Instagram, how to write clever tweets." "Sarah, I've just closed a deal for a £12 million development project. Real money, real success, real impact. What you're doing? It's not a career, it's a hobby that pays pocket change." The conversation had continued for another 20 minutes, with David offering increasingly patronizing advice about practical career choices and realistic expectations. He had suggested she consider returning to school for something more substantial, perhaps business administration or accounting, or maybe consider relocating to London where he could help her find a proper position with a respectable firm. "The thing is, Sarah," he had concluded, "you've always been the dreamer in the family. There's nothing wrong with that, but at some point, dreams have to give way to reality. You can't build a life on wishful thinking and creative energy. Success requires discipline, strategy, and most importantly, the ability to recognize your limitations." After ending that call, Sarah had sat in her darkened apartment for nearly 3 hours, staring at her reflection in the rain-streaked window. She had felt something crystallizing within her. Not anger exactly, but something far more powerful and enduring. It was the quiet, steel-edged determination of someone who had just been told they were incapable of achieving something they had never truly attempted. The next morning, she had awakened with a clarity of purpose that surprised her. If David could build an empire from strategic thinking and relentless execution, then she would do the same. But she would do it quietly, methodically, and without asking for anyone's help or approval. Her first step had been to conduct a brutally honest assessment of her skills and the market opportunities available to her. Digital marketing was indeed evolving rapidly, but rather than being a disadvantage, this constant change represented an opportunity for someone willing to stay ahead of the curve. While established agencies were still relying on traditional approaches, there was an enormous gap in the market for innovative, data-driven strategies that could deliver measurable results. She had started by offering her services to small local businesses, restaurants, boutiques, service providers who couldn't afford the fees charged by major marketing firms, but desperately needed to establish an online presence. Her first client had been a family-owned Italian restaurant in South Beach, whose owner, Maria Torino, had been struggling to attract customers beyond the local neighborhood regulars. Working 18-hour days, Sarah had developed a comprehensive digital strategy that included everything from social media management to targeted advertising campaigns. She had studied the restaurant's customer base, analyzed local dining trends, and created content that told the story of Maria's family recipes and immigrant heritage. Within 3 months, the restaurant's revenue had increased by 60%, and there was a waiting list for weekend reservations. Word of her success had spread through Miami's tight-knit business community, with the speed that only accompanies genuinely remarkable results. Within 6 months, she had a waiting list of potential clients, and within a year, she had hired her first employee, a talented graphic designer named Carlos, who shared her vision of combining creativity with analytical precision. But success in business, Sarah had learned, was only partially about strategy and execution. The other crucial component was understanding human psychology, knowing what motivated people to make purchasing decisions, what fears drove their choices, and what desires they were willing to pay to fulfill. This insight had led to her breakthrough moment, when she had been approached by a mid-sized hospitality chain struggling to differentiate itself in Florida's competitive tourism market. The challenge had been complex: how to position a collection of moderately priced hotels as the preferred choice for families seeking authentic Florida experiences, while simultaneously appealing to business travelers who valued efficiency and comfort. Sarah's solution had been elegantly simple yet profoundly effective. Instead of focusing on the hotel's amenities or competitive pricing, she had created a campaign that told stories of families discovering hidden beaches, of business travelers finding moments of tranquility between meetings, of couples celebrating anniversaries in settings that felt both luxurious and genuine. The campaign had exceeded every projection. Occupancy rates had increased by 40% during the first year, and the client had expanded their contract to include properties in Georgia and South Carolina. More importantly, the success had established Sarah's reputation as someone who could deliver results that traditional marketing approaches couldn't achieve. Throughout this period of rapid growth, David's monthly phone calls had continued, though their tone had gradually shifted from concerned advice to casual check-ins. He would ask about her little marketing business, with the same affectionate condescension he might have shown toward a child's lemonade stand. Sarah had never corrected his assumptions or shared details about her expanding client base, her growing team, or the increasingly impressive revenue figures that were accumulating in her business accounts. There had been something profoundly satisfying about this silence, something that felt like gathering strength in preparation for a moment that had not yet arrived. Each time David spoke about his latest acquisition or his expanding network of influential contacts, Sarah would offer appropriate congratulations while keeping her own achievements private. She had been building something far more substantial than her brother realized, but she had been building it in the shadows, away from the expectations and judgments that had once made her question her own capabilities. The decision to expand beyond Florida had come during her 3rd year of operation, when a client in Atlanta had specifically requested her services after seeing the results she had achieved for similar businesses in Miami. The success of this project had led to opportunities in New York, and within 18 months, Sarah had established offices in 3 major southeastern cities, each staffed with carefully selected professionals who shared her commitment to innovation and excellence. But expansion had brought new challenges. Managing a multi-city operation required skills that extended far beyond marketing expertise. Sarah had been forced to become proficient in areas she had never previously considered: financial management, human resources, legal compliance, strategic planning. She had hired consultants, attended seminars, and spent countless hours studying the operational strategies of successful entrepreneurs. The learning curve had been steep and occasionally overwhelming. There had been nights when she had questioned whether she was capable of managing the complexity of what her company was becoming. There had been moments of doubt, when David's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her of her limitations and suggesting that she was attempting something beyond her capabilities. But those moments of uncertainty had been balanced by increasingly frequent experiences of triumph. When her New York office had secured a contract with a Fortune 500 company, when her innovative approach to influencer marketing had been featured in a major industry publication, when her revenue projections had exceeded her most optimistic estimates, in those moments, Sarah had felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had not only proved their critics wrong, but had exceeded their own expectations in the process. The purchase of the Serenity had been both a celebration of her success and a symbol of the distance she had traveled from the uncertain young woman who had once doubted her own potential. The yacht represented more than luxury. It was tangible proof that the girl David had dismissed as a dreamer had become a woman capable of turning dreams into reality through intelligence, persistence, and strategic thinking. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Sarah's transformation had been internal. The insecurity and need for approval that had once defined her relationship with her family had been replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing she had built something meaningful and substantial. She no longer needed David's validation or recognition, though she had to admit there was still a part of her that looked forward to the moment when he would finally see her as she truly was. That moment was now approaching with the inexorable certainty of an incoming tide. As she watched her family draw closer to the pier, Sarah could see David's expression shifting from casual interest to active assessment. His businessman's eye was clearly evaluating the scene before him, trying to determine how his little sister had managed to arrange such an impressive setting for their parents' celebration. She could predict his thought process with startling accuracy. He would assume she had rented the yacht, probably stretching her modest resources to provide their parents with a memorable experience. He might even approve of this gesture, viewing it as evidence that she was finally learning to invest in meaningful experiences rather than frivolous pursuits. The irony was exquisite. David's assumptions about her financial limitations were about to collide with a reality that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, family, and the sister he had left behind. But the revelation would come in its own time, at the moment when maximum impact could be achieved. For now, Sarah was content to watch and wait, feeling the familiar weight of the yacht's keys in her pocket and savoring the anticipation of what was about to unfold. The morning sun continued to climb higher, casting ever-changing patterns of light and shadow across the marina's pristine waters, while the gentle sound of waves against hulls provided a rhythmic soundtrack to the approaching confrontation. David was now close enough that Sarah could see the details of his expression, the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most successful person in any room, the subtle air of judgment that accompanied his assessment of their surroundings, and something else. Something that looked almost like preparation for the moment when he would need to take control of a situation that required his superior knowledge and experience. What he could not have anticipated was that this situation would require nothing from him except the ability to recognize that his assumptions about his sister's capabilities were about to be dramatically, irrevocably challenged. The stage was set for a revelation that would reshape not only their relationship, but David's entire understanding of what his little sister had become during the years he had been building his empire across the ocean. But as David's confident stride brings him closer to the truth, will his businessman's instinct prepare him for the shock that awaits? And how will Sarah navigate the delicate balance between revealing her success and maintaining the family harmony that this celebration is meant to honor? The convergence of expectation and reality rarely occurs with the dramatic precision that transforms ordinary moments into defining memories. But as David Mitchell's Italian leather shoes carried him closer to the truth that awaited at Pier 7, the universe seemed to conspire in creating exactly such a moment. Sarah watched her brother's approach with the measured calm of someone who had spent years preparing for this precise instant, though she could never have predicted the exact circumstances that would bring it about. The morning sun had reached its optimal angle, casting the Serenity in a golden light that emphasized every elegant line of her hull, every carefully crafted detail that marked her as a vessel of exceptional quality and considerable value. David's stride maintained its characteristic confidence, but Sarah could detect subtle changes in his demeanor as his experienced eye began to catalog the impressive array of yachts surrounding them. She knew that he was conducting the kind of rapid assessment that successful businessmen performed instinctively, evaluating, categorizing, determining the approximate value and status implications of everything within his field of vision. Their parents, Margaret and Robert, walked slightly behind David, their faces radiant with the joy of a couple anticipating a celebration that would mark 4 decades of shared dreams and accumulated memories. Margaret's hand rested gently on Robert's arm, and occasionally she would pause to point out a particularly beautiful yacht or to comment on the pristine condition of the marina facilities. "This is absolutely wonderful, sweetheart," Margaret called out as they drew within conversational distance. "When you said we would be celebrating on a yacht, I never imagined anything quite this magnificent." Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that accompanied her mother's enthusiasm. "I wanted everything to be perfect for your anniversary, Mom. 40 years deserves nothing less than the best." It was at this moment that David's assessment reached its logical conclusion. His gaze had been systematically moving from vessel to vessel, clearly trying to determine which of the impressive yachts would be hosting their celebration. When his eyes finally settled on the Serenity, moored majestically at the end of their pier, Sarah saw his expression shift from casual interest to something approaching surprise. The Serenity was undeniably the crown jewel of this section of the marina. At 58 feet, she commanded attention not merely through size, but through the unmistakable elegance that marked her as a vessel of extraordinary quality. Her pristine white hull gleamed in the morning sunlight, while her sleek lines and sophisticated design spoke of both aesthetic excellence and substantial financial investment. David paused mid-stride, his businessman's eye clearly calculating the approximate value of what he was seeing. Sarah could practically observe his mental processes as he evaluated the yacht's specifications, estimated its purchase price, and tried to reconcile this information with his understanding of his sister's financial capabilities. "Impressive," he said finally, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when acknowledging quality while maintaining emotional distance. "Someone certainly spared no expense. This must be costing you a fortune, Sarah." The comment hung in the air with the weight of an assumption seeking confirmation. Sarah could hear the subtle implication, the suggestion that she was overextending herself financially to provide this experience, perhaps even irresponsibly so. It was precisely the kind of gentle condescension that had characterized their relationship for years, the assumption that her decisions required his guidance or at least his approval. "David," their father interjected with evident pride, "you should see what Sarah has accomplished over the past few years. She's built quite an impressive business." But David's attention remained focused on the yacht, his expression reflecting the kind of calculation that preceded what Sarah recognized as his preparation to take control of the situation. She had seen this look countless times during their childhood, the moment when David decided that circumstances required his intervention, his superior knowledge, his ability to manage situations that others might find overwhelming. "Sarah, I have to ask," David said, his voice taking on the tone of concerned elder brother mixed with seasoned businessman. "Have you really thought through the financial implications of this? Chartering a yacht of this caliber for a day must cost at least $15,000 to $20,000, possibly more. That's a significant expenditure, especially for someone in your situation." The pause before the word situation carried volumes of meaning. It encompassed David's understanding of Sarah's financial limitations, his assumption about her modest income from what he perceived as a small marketing business, and his concern that she might be making an imprudent financial decision out of a desire to impress their parents. Sarah felt something crystallizing within her, not anger, but a clarity of purpose that had been building for years. This was the moment she had been unconsciously preparing for, the convergence of all her achievements with the opportunity to reveal the truth about the woman she had become. "Actually, David," she said, her voice maintaining perfect calm while her fingers traced the outline of the keys in her pocket, "I've thought through the financial implications quite thoroughly." But David was not finished. His businessman's instincts had apparently identified what he perceived as a teachable moment, an opportunity to provide guidance that would prevent his sister from making a costly mistake. "Look, I understand the impulse, he continued, his tone becoming increasingly patronizing. Mom and Dad deserve a wonderful celebration, and you want to give them something special. That's admirable. But there are ways to create memorable experiences without putting yourself in financial jeopardy. He gestured toward the Serenity with the air of someone explaining obvious facts to someone who lacked his level of sophistication. A yacht like this represents serious money, not just the charter fee, but the insurance, the crew, the fuel, the catering. You're probably looking at $25,000 to $30,000 for a single day, minimum. That's more than most people spend on a car. Sarah could see other family members beginning to arrive and gather within hearing distance. Her cousin Jennifer was listening with obvious interest, while her Aunt Patricia had paused in her conversation to observe what was clearly becoming a significant moment. The morning sun continued to cast its golden light across the scene, creating an almost theatrical backdrop for what was about to unfold. "David," she said quietly, "I appreciate your concern, but this is exactly what I was talking about during our last conversation," David interrupted, his voice gaining momentum as he warmed to his theme. "You've always been impulsive when it comes to money. Remember when you spent your entire savings on that photography equipment, convinced you were going to become a professional photographer? Or when you invested in that friend's restaurant that failed within 6 months? The references to her past financial mistakes were particularly cutting because they contained enough truth to sting. Sarah had indeed made some questionable decisions during her 20s, investments born more of enthusiasm than careful analysis. But those experiences had taught her valuable lessons about due diligence and risk assessment, lessons that had informed every decision she had made since building her business. "You have a good heart, Sarah," David continued, his tone now carrying the full weight of elder brother authority. "But good intentions don't change financial reality. This cruise celebration is only for people who have achieved real success in life, not for those who are still struggling to find their footing." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, their implications reverberating through the assembled family members. Sarah felt the familiar weight of years of accumulated assumptions, years of being seen as the impractical dreamer, the little sister who needed guidance and protection from her own poor judgment. But this time, something was different. This time, she possessed information that would completely transform the dynamic of this conversation. This time, she held in her pocket the means to reveal a truth that would challenge every assumption David had just articulated. "You're absolutely right, David," she said, her voice remaining perfectly calm despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "This cruise celebration is indeed only for people who have achieved real success in life." She could see confusion beginning to creep into David's expression. Something in her tone, some subtle shift in her demeanor, was suggesting that this conversation was not proceeding as he had anticipated. "I'm glad you understand," he said, though his voice now carried a note of uncertainty. "I just want to make sure you're not setting yourself up for financial difficulties. Maybe we could look into chartering something smaller, more within your budget range. There are some very nice boats available for $5,000 or $6,000 that would still provide a wonderful experience for Mom and Dad." Sarah smiled, feeling the culmination of years of preparation, years of building something extraordinary while remaining silent about her achievements. The moment had arrived when silence would give way to revelation, when assumptions would collide with reality, when the little sister David thought he knew would reveal herself to be someone entirely different. "That's very thoughtful of you, David," she said, reaching into her pocket and withdrawing the set of silver keys that would change everything. "But there won't be any charter fees." The confusion in David's expression deepened. She could see him trying to process this information, trying to understand how there could be no charter fees for a yacht of this obvious quality and value. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "If you're not chartering the yacht, then how?" Sarah held up the keys, allowing the morning sunlight to catch the polished silver surface and reflect small rainbows across the assembled faces of her family. The keys were distinctive, clearly expensive, and unmistakably genuine, not the kind of temporary tokens that rental companies provided to their clients. "Because, David," she said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had waited years for this precise moment, "the yacht is mine." The effect of these 4 words was immediate and profound. David's confident expression vanished, replaced by something that resembled shock mixed with complete bewilderment. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. For the first time in Sarah's memory, her supremely confident older brother appeared to be genuinely speechless. The silence that followed seemed to stretch beyond its natural boundaries, filled with the sound of gentle waves against hulls, the distant cries of seagulls, and the almost audible process of assumptions being shattered and reformed. Sarah could see David's mind working furiously, trying to reconcile this impossible information with everything he thought he knew about his sister's circumstances. "What did you say?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I said the yacht is mine," Sarah repeated, her tone remaining perfectly calm while her heart raced with the magnitude of this revelation. "The Serenity belongs to me." David's gaze moved from the keys in Sarah's hand to the magnificent yacht moored before them, then back to his sister's face, searching for some indication that this was an elaborate joke or misunderstanding. But Sarah's expression remained steady, composed, and utterly serious. But that's impossible," David stammered, his usual eloquence deserting him completely. "You can't. How could you possibly? The cost alone." Sarah could see the exact moment when the full implications began to dawn on him. A yacht like the Serenity represented not just a significant purchase, but evidence of the kind of substantial financial success that he had always assumed was beyond his sister's capabilities. If she truly owned this vessel, then everything he thought he knew about her life, her career, her achievements, was fundamentally incorrect. The realization was clearly staggering. David's face had gone pale, and his usual air of command and confidence had been replaced by something approaching shock. He looked like a man whose entire understanding of reality had been suddenly and irrevocably altered. But the revelation was far from complete. Sarah could see Captain Thompson approaching from the yacht's gangway, his weathered face breaking into a professional smile as he prepared to greet the guests who would be celebrating aboard his vessel. In moments, his acknowledgement of Sarah as the Serenity's owner would provide irrefutable confirmation of what David was still struggling to accept. The morning sun continued to climb higher, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across a scene that had transformed from a simple family gathering into a moment of truth that would reshape relationships and challenge assumptions that had remained unchallenged for years. But as the shocking reality of Sarah's ownership begins to sink in, how will David's worldview adapt to this complete reversal of everything he believed about success, family, and the sister he thought he knew? And what other surprises await as the true scope of Sarah's achievements becomes apparent to the family that had always seen her as the dreamer who would never quite find her way? The silence that followed Sarah's revelation possessed a quality that seemed to suspend time itself, as if the universe had paused to allow the magnitude of this moment to fully register among the assembled witnesses. David Mitchell, a man whose entire adult life had been built upon the foundation of his superior understanding of success and his protective authority over his younger sister, found himself confronting a reality so fundamentally at odds with his assumptions that his mind struggled to process the information. Sarah watched her brother's face with a mixture of satisfaction and unexpected sympathy as she witnessed the systematic collapse of everything he thought he knew about their family dynamic. The confident businessman who had arrived at the marina prepared to guide his impractical sister through yet another example of her financial naivety was being confronted with evidence that challenged not just his assumptions about Sarah, but his entire understanding of who had achieved what in their family. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell," came a warm voice from behind them, cutting through the tension with the timing of perfect dramatic irony. Captain Robert Thompson approached from the Serenity's gangway, his weathered face breaking into the professional smile of someone genuinely pleased to see a valued client. "Everything is prepared for your parents' anniversary celebration. The crew has been working since dawn to ensure every detail meets your specifications." David's head turned toward the captain with mechanical precision, his eyes widening as he processed this external confirmation of what his mind was still rejecting. Here was an obviously experienced maritime professional addressing Sarah with the respectful familiarity reserved for yacht owners, not the polite distance maintained with charter clients. "Thank you, Captain Thompson," Sarah replied with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to managing such arrangements. "I trust the champagne we discussed has been properly chilled, and the catering staff understands the dietary restrictions for Aunt Patricia?" "Absolutely, Miss Mitchell. Your attention to detail is what makes these celebrations so memorable." We've also prepared the upper deck exactly as you requested, with the floral arrangements positioned to catch the best light for photographs. The captain's words carried the weight of established relationship, suggesting a history of previous interactions and shared experiences. This was clearly not Sarah's first time organizing events aboard the Serenity, not her introduction to the complexities of yacht ownership, but rather the comfortable interaction between a knowledgeable owner and her trusted crew. David's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, resembling a man drowning in his own disbelief. The color had drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and somehow smaller than he had appeared just moments before. His usual air of command had evaporated, replaced by something approaching vulnerability that Sarah had never seen in her confident older brother. I don't understand, David finally managed, his voice hoarse with shock. Sarah, how is this possible? How could you afford? His inability to complete coherent sentences was particularly striking, given his usual eloquence and command of language. The businessman who routinely negotiated million-pound deals was struggling to articulate basic questions about his sister's circumstances. Margaret and Robert Mitchell had been observing this exchange with growing amazement, their faces reflecting a mixture of pride, surprise, and dawning understanding. Margaret stepped forward, placing her hand gently on David's arm. "Darling," she said softly, "we've been trying to tell you about Sarah's success for years, but you were always so busy with your own projects in London. She's built something truly remarkable here." Robert nodded, his eyes shining with paternal pride. "Our daughter owns 3 offices now, David. Miami, Atlanta, and New York. She's become quite the entrepreneur, though she's always been modest about her achievements." The words seemed to strike David like physical blows. Each piece of information contradicted years of assumptions he had maintained about his sister's capabilities and circumstances. The little sister he had been protecting from financial irresponsibility was apparently a successful business owner whose achievements rivaled his own. 3 offices? David repeated weakly, as if saying the words aloud might help him process their meaning. But you never mentioned, in our phone calls, you never said? Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions as she watched her brother's worldview crumble. There was satisfaction in finally revealing the truth, but also unexpected sympathy for a man who was discovering that his protective instincts had been based on completely incorrect information. "You never asked about specifics, David," she said gently. "You would call and ask how the little marketing business was going, but you never inquired about clients, revenue, growth, or expansion plans. I think you preferred to maintain your mental image of me as someone who needed your guidance, rather than learning about who I had actually become." The observation was delivered without malice, but its accuracy was devastating. David's face reflected the painful recognition that his assumptions about Sarah had been maintained through willful ignorance, rather than careful observation. He had been so committed to his role as the successful older brother that he had failed to notice his sister's transformation into a successful entrepreneur in her own right. Jennifer, who had been watching this exchange with fascination, stepped closer to examine the keys in Sarah's hand. "These are beautiful," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "They look like they're custom-made." "They are," Sarah confirmed. "The yacht builder provides custom keys to each owner. These are sterling silver with the Serenity's registration number engraved on the back." She turned the key over, revealing the intricate engraving that confirmed not only the yacht's identity, but also her ownership. The level of detail was clearly beyond what any rental company would provide, offering irrefutable evidence that this was not a charter arrangement, but genuine ownership of a substantial maritime asset. David stared at the engraved key as if it were an artifact from an alien civilization. His entire framework for understanding his family's dynamics was collapsing, and he seemed unable to construct a replacement that could accommodate this new information. "But the cost," he said weakly, his businessman's mind fixating on the financial implications even as his emotional understanding struggled to adapt. "A yacht like this must have cost, what, 2 million? 3 million? More?" Captain Thompson, who had been preparing to discreetly withdraw, paused at the question. "If I may say so, sir, Miss Mitchell chose exceptionally well. The Serenity is a custom build from one of Italy's finest shipyards. She represents not just luxury, but a very sound investment." Yachts of this caliber tend to hold their value remarkably well. The captain's comments carried the implicit suggestion that Sarah had made her purchase with the kind of careful consideration and financial sophistication that David had always assumed she lacked. This was not an impulsive buy from someone overwhelmed by the excitement of success, but a calculated investment made by someone who understood both luxury and financial prudence. Investment, David repeated hollowly. You bought this as an investment. Among other things, Sarah confirmed. The Serenity serves multiple purposes. She's available for charter when I'm not using her, which generates excellent revenue. She's also a wonderful venue for corporate events and client entertainment, and occasionally she hosts family celebrations. Each revelation added another layer to David's growing understanding of how completely he had misjudged his sister's situation. Not only did she own this impressive yacht, but she was operating it as part of a sophisticated business strategy that generated additional income while providing lifestyle benefits. Aunt Patricia, who had been listening with evident delight, clasped her hands together. Sarah, this is absolutely wonderful. I had no idea you had become so successful. David, isn't this exciting? Your sister has accomplished something truly remarkable. But David appeared incapable of sharing in this excitement. His face showed the strain of someone trying to reconcile irreconcilable information. Years of phone conversations in which he had offered guidance to his supposedly struggling sister were being recontextualized as interactions with someone who had been quietly building an empire while allowing him to maintain his illusions. The phone calls, he said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of accusation mixed with hurt. All those times I offered advice, suggested you consider more practical career options, worried about your financial stability. You let me believe. I let you believe what you wanted to believe, Sarah said firmly, but not unkindly. Every time you called, you spoke about my little marketing business without asking about specifics. You offered advice about practical career choices without inquiring about my actual clients or revenue. You worried about my financial stability without asking about my business's growth or profitability. The accuracy of this assessment was clearly painful for David to acknowledge. He had constructed an image of his sister based on outdated information and maintained it through selective attention to details that confirmed his preconceptions, while ignoring evidence that contradicted them. You could have told me, he said, his voice now carrying a note of genuine hurt alongside the shock. You could have shared your success, let me be proud of you, included me in your achievements. Sarah considered this carefully before responding. Could I, David? Really? Think about our conversations over the past 5 years. How many times did you express genuine curiosity about my work? How many times did you ask questions that suggested you saw me as a professional rather than as your little sister who needed guidance? The question hung in the air between them, challenging David to examine his own behavior with the same critical eye he applied to business situations. The silence that followed suggested he was beginning to recognize uncomfortable truths about his assumptions and communication patterns. Margaret stepped closer to Sarah, her eyes shining with maternal pride. We've been so proud of you, sweetheart. Watching you build your business, seeing your confidence grow, witnessing your success. It's been one of the greatest joys of our lives. But you never said, David began, then stopped as he realized the implication of his words. His parents had been aware of Sarah's achievements all along. He had been the only one operating under false assumptions about his sister's circumstances. Robert placed a gentle hand on David's shoulder. Son, we've mentioned Sarah's business success in dozens of conversations over the years. But you were always so focused on your own projects, your own challenges, that I think you heard what you expected to hear, rather than what we were actually saying. This observation was perhaps the most devastating of all, because it suggested that David's ignorance about Sarah's achievements was not simply a matter of poor communication, but the result of his own selective attention and unconscious bias. He had been so invested in his role as the successful older brother that he had filtered out information that contradicted this narrative. The morning sun had continued its upward journey, and the marina was now fully alive with activity. Other yacht owners were preparing for their own adventures, their voices and laughter providing a cheerful backdrop to this family drama. The contrast between the celebratory atmosphere around them and the intensity of their conversation created an almost surreal quality to the moment. Sarah could see that David was struggling not just with the factual information about her success, but with the deeper implications for his self-concept and their relationship. For years, he had derived satisfaction from his role as the accomplished older brother who provided guidance and support to his less successful sibling. This identity was now being challenged in ways that went far beyond simple surprise or disappointment. "I need to understand," David said finally, his voice stronger now but still carrying the strain of someone trying to rebuild his worldview in real time. "Your business. How successful are we talking about? What kind of revenue? How many employees? What's the scope of what you've built?" Sarah recognized this question as David's attempt to process her achievements in terms he could understand and evaluate. He was reverting to his businessman's instincts, trying to quantify her success in ways that would allow him to place it within his existing framework of accomplishment and competition. "The business generates approximately $12 million in annual revenue," Sarah said simply. "We employ 43 people across our 3 offices, and we're currently evaluating opportunities for expansion into the West Coast market." The numbers seemed to hit David like physical objects. His eyes widened, and he took an involuntary step backward. $12 million in annual revenue placed Sarah's business firmly in the category of significant commercial success, far beyond what he had imagined possible for his sister's little marketing business. $12 million, he repeated slowly, as if testing the sound of the words. That's more than my London operation generated last year." The admission escaped him before he could consider its implications, and Sarah could see the moment when he realized he had just acknowledged that his supposedly struggling little sister had built a business that was outperforming his own established enterprise. The revelation created a moment of perfect silence, broken only by the gentle sound of water against hulls and the distant hum of marina activity. David stood frozen, his face reflecting the complex emotions of someone whose entire understanding of family dynamics, professional achievement, and personal identity was being fundamentally challenged. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this moment was what it revealed about the future of their relationship. Years of assumptions, protective instincts, and unconscious condescension were being swept away, leaving space for something entirely new to emerge. The question that remained was whether David possessed the emotional flexibility to adapt to this new reality, or whether the challenge to his long-held beliefs would create lasting damage to their family bond. As David struggles to reconcile this earth-shattering revelation with years of deeply held assumptions, will he find the strength to embrace his sister's success? And what will Sarah discover about forgiveness and family when she sees her powerful brother at his most vulnerable moment? The transformation that occurred in David Mitchell over the following hours would later be remembered by every family member present as one of the most profound examples of personal growth they had ever witnessed. What began as shock and confusion gradually evolved into something far more complex and ultimately redemptive, the painful but necessary process of a man confronting the limitations of his own perspective and finding the courage to change. As the Serenity left the marina and began her journey into the open waters of the Atlantic, David stood at the bow, his hands gripping the polished rail with white-knuckled intensity. The Miami skyline receded behind them, replaced by an endless expanse of azure water that seemed to mirror the vastness of his emotional upheaval. Sarah had given him space to process the morning's revelations, understanding intuitively that her brother needed time to rebuild his understanding of their relationship from the ground up. The yacht's motion through the swells was smooth and confident, a testament to both the vessel's superior engineering and Captain Thompson's expertise. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, attending to the comfort of the anniversary guests, while maintaining the respectful discretion that marked professional maritime service. Everything about the experience spoke of careful planning, substantial investment, and the kind of attention to detail that only comes from someone who truly understands luxury and how to provide it. Margaret and Robert Mitchell were in their element, surrounded by family members who had gathered to celebrate their 4 decades of marriage. The joy on their faces was infectious, and gradually the emotional intensity of the morning's revelations began to blend with the celebratory atmosphere that Sarah had worked so hard to create. This was, after all, their day, a milestone that deserved to be honored without the shadow of family drama. But David remained apart from the festivities, struggling with emotions that were both familiar and completely foreign. The sensation of being fundamentally wrong about something important was not new to him. Business involved constant risk assessment and the possibility of miscalculation. However, being wrong about his sister's capabilities about their family dynamics, about his own role as protector and guide, cut far deeper than any professional setback ever had. As the morning progressed into afternoon, David found himself observing Sarah with new eyes. He watched her interact with the crew, noting the easy authority with which she managed complex logistics, while ensuring that every family member felt attended to and valued. He observed her conversation with their elderly uncle about his recent health concerns, her patient attention to their young cousin's excited chatter about school, her graceful navigation of the social dynamics that made family gatherings either memorable or disastrous. This was not the impractical dreamer he had carried in his mental picture for so many years. This was a woman who had mastered not just the technical aspects of building a successful business, but the interpersonal skills that made her effective as a leader and beloved as a family member. The disconnect between his assumptions and reality was not just significant, it was almost complete. Around midday, as the yacht anchored in calm waters off the coast, Sarah approached her brother with the careful demeanor of someone extending an olive branch while remaining prepared for rejection. "The water is beautiful here," she said simply, standing beside him at the rail. "I often come to this spot when I need to think clearly about difficult decisions." David glanced at her, noting the implication that she was familiar with these waters, that this was not a special charter location, but a place she visited regularly aboard her own vessel. Each small detail added another layer to his growing understanding of how completely he had misjudged her life. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent hours wrestling with uncomfortable truths, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened this morning." She waited patiently, recognizing that he needed to work through his thoughts at his own pace. "I've been thinking about our phone conversations over the past 5 years," he continued, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Really thinking about them, trying to remember not just what I said, but how I listened. And I'm realizing that I wasn't listening at all. I was waiting for confirmation of what I already believed about your situation." The admission was clearly difficult for him, but Sarah could hear the genuine remorse in his voice. This was not the calculated apology of someone trying to manage a social situation, but the painful honesty of someone confronting their own failings. "When Mom and Dad mentioned your business success, I filtered it through my assumption that they were being supportive parents, exaggerating modest achievements to boost your confidence. When you mentioned clients or projects, I categorized them as small-scale efforts that were valuable for experience, but not indicators of real success." David turned to face her directly, his expression carrying a vulnerability she had never seen before. "I robbed you of the opportunity to share your achievements with someone who should have been celebrating them. Worse, I robbed myself of the opportunity to know and appreciate the remarkable woman you've become." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of relief. For years, she had carried the weight of feeling unseen and undervalued by the brother whose opinion had always mattered so much to her. His acknowledgement of these failures meant more than any celebration of her business success could have. "David," she said softly, "I wasn't entirely innocent in this dynamic. I could have been more direct about my achievements, could have insisted that you pay attention to the details of my life. But I think part of me enjoyed the secret satisfaction of succeeding while you remained unaware. There was something powerful about building something impressive while you continued to see me as someone who needed protection." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the gentle movement of waves around the anchored yacht. The sound of family laughter drifted across the water, reminding them that this day was ultimately about celebration and connection, rather than confrontation and revelation. "Tell me about the business," David said eventually. "Really tell me. I want to understand what you've built, how you built it, what challenges you've overcome. I want to know my sister as she actually is, not as I assumed she was." Over the next hour, as their parents and other family members enjoyed lunch on the main deck, Sarah shared the story of her entrepreneurial journey with the kind of detail and honesty that had been missing from their relationship for years. She spoke about the early struggles, the moments of doubt, the strategic decisions that had driven her growth, and the satisfaction of building something meaningful through her own intelligence and determination. David listened with the focused attention of someone trying to make up for years of inattentiveness. He asked thoughtful questions, offered observations based on his own business experience, and began to see his sister not as someone who needed his guidance, but as a peer whose achievements were worthy of respect and admiration. As the afternoon progressed, their conversation expanded beyond business, to encompass their hopes for the future, their reflections on family relationships, and their shared desire to rebuild their connection on a foundation of mutual respect, rather than outdated assumptions. The defensive barriers that had characterized their interactions for years began to dissolve, replaced by the kind of honest communication that creates genuine intimacy between siblings. When the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the family gathered on the upper deck for the ceremonial toast to Margaret and Robert's anniversary. Sarah had arranged for the crew to serve champagne in crystal glasses while soft music played from hidden speakers, creating an atmosphere of elegant celebration that perfectly honored 4 decades of marriage. Robert stood to address the assembled family, his voice carrying the emotion of someone reflecting on a life well lived and shared with the woman he loved. 40 years ago, Margaret and I promised to build a life together based on love, respect, and mutual support. Looking around at our children and grandchildren, at the success they've achieved and the love they share, I can say with complete confidence that we kept that promise. He raised his glass toward Sarah and David, who stood side by side at the rail. To our children, who have grown into adults we could never have imagined when they were young. To Sarah, whose determination and intelligence have created something remarkable, and to David, whose willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and grow from them shows the kind of character that makes us proud to be his parents. The toast was met with enthusiastic agreement from the assembled family, but Sarah noticed that David's eyes were bright with unshed tears. The day had been transformative for him in ways that extended far beyond learning about her business success. He had been forced to confront assumptions about himself, about family dynamics, and about the nature of success that had shaped his identity for years. As the yacht began its return journey to Miami, David and Sarah remained at the rail, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. The celebration continued around them, but they had found a pocket of peaceful intimacy that allowed for the kind of conversation that repairs relationships and builds new foundations for the future. "I have a confession," David said, as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "Part of me always resented the responsibility I felt to be your protector and guide. It was a burden I thought I had to carry as the older brother, but I also derived identity and satisfaction from it. Learning that you never needed my protection, that you were actually more successful than I was in many ways, it's forced me to examine who I am when I'm not playing that role." Sarah considered this carefully before responding. "Maybe the role you're meant to play isn't protector or guide, but simply brother. Maybe we're meant to be equals who support each other rather than one person taking care of another." The simplicity of this observation was profound. For the first time in their adult lives, they were seeing each other clearly, not through the lens of outdated family roles or unconscious assumptions, but as individuals who had grown and achieved and struggled in their own ways. As the Miami skyline came into view, illuminated by the lights of a city that never truly sleeps, Sarah felt a sense of completion that went beyond the successful celebration of their parents' anniversary. The relationship with her brother that she had always wanted, one based on mutual respect and genuine understanding, was finally becoming possible. The Serenity docked at the marina with the same smooth efficiency that had marked her departure. Family members began to disembark, expressing their gratitude for what had been not just a celebration, but a transformative experience that had brought them closer together. Margaret and Robert were radiant, clearly thrilled by both the luxury of the celebration and the evident reconciliation between their children. As the evening wound down and family members prepared to return to their own lives, David approached Sarah one final time. The man who had arrived that morning full of confidence and assumptions had been replaced by someone humbler, but ultimately more authentic. "Sarah," he said, "I want you to know that this has been one of the most important days of my life. Not just because I learned about your success, but because I learned about my own limitations and blind spots. I hope you'll be patient with me as I try to become the brother you deserve." Sarah embraced him with genuine warmth, feeling the emotional barriers that had separated them for years finally dissolving completely. "We both have things to learn about being better siblings," she said, "but I think we've made an excellent start." As I stand here now, 3 years later, on the deck of the Serenity as she cuts through the waters of the Caribbean, I often think about that transformative day and the lessons it taught us about assumptions, family, and the price of not truly seeing the people we love. David and I speak regularly now, real conversations about our businesses, our challenges, our successes, and our dreams for the future. He's visited my offices, met my team, and become one of my most trusted advisors when I face difficult strategic decisions. In return, I've spent time in London, learning about his business and the life he's built there. Our relationship is stronger now than it ever was during our childhood, built on the foundation of mutual respect and genuine understanding that can only exist between equals. The protective dynamic that once defined our interactions has been replaced by something far more valuable, a partnership between siblings who see each other clearly and support each other unconditionally. But I often wonder, if you were in my position, having achieved success while feeling undervalued and unseen by someone whose opinion mattered deeply to you, what would you have done differently? Would you have been more direct about your achievements, demanding recognition rather than waiting for it to be offered? Would you have confronted the assumptions earlier, or would you have savored the secret satisfaction of succeeding while remaining underestimated? And from where I sit now, anchored in the crystal clear waters off the coast of Barbados, sharing this story with you as the sun sets over the Caribbean horizon, I can say with certainty that sometimes the most profound victories are not the ones we achieve in business or career, but the ones we win in our relationships with the people who matter most. The question that remains is this: when faced with the choice between being right and being connected, between proving a point and preserving a relationship, what would you choose? And are you certain that the people closest to you truly see who you've become, rather than who they assume you to be?